Ronald Joseph DeFeo Jr., known as Butch to friends and family, was born September 26, 1951. In 1974, at the age of 23, he would shoot and murder 6 of his family members in their home at 112 Ocean Avenue in Amityville, a section of Long Island, New York. His victims would include his parents, Ronald Sr. and Louise, as well as his siblings Dawn, Allison, Mark, and John Matthew. So what happened to cause such a horrific thing to occur on the morning of November 13, 1974? Here is their story. On June 28, 1965, the DeFeos purchased a large Dutch colonial home and relocated from Brooklyn, New York to 112 Ocean Avenue in Amityville. The house is 2 stories with an attic, several rooms, and a boathouse that sits on the Amityville River. Shortly after relocating, Ronald Sr. had a sign made for the front yard saying High Hopes, symbolizing what the new home meant for the family. Beneath all of the success and appearances of happiness laid the hot temper of Ronald Sr. that resulted in the verbal and physical abuse of his wife and children, especially Ronald Jr. After years of abuse and violent outbursts between the 2 men, Ronald Jr. began using drugs such as heroin, LSD, and heavy drinking. By the time Ronald Jr. was 18, the altercations between them were growing more and more frequent. One evening, Ronald Sr. and Louise began to fight, and without hesitation it is said that Donald Jr. grabbed a 12-gauge shotgun from his room, loaded a shell, and pointed the barrel of the gun at his father's face to break up the fight. Ronald Jr. pulled the trigger, but the gun failed to go off. Would this be a foreshadowing of what was to come to not only his father but his entire family? In the early morning hour of 3 a.m. on Wednesday, November 13, 1974, Ronald DeFeo Jr. walked over to his closet and picked up a .35 caliber Marlin rifle. He then headed quietly towards his parents' bedroom and made his way to the foot of their bed. He then lifted the rifle, pulled the trigger, and shot the first of 8 deadly shots that early morning. The first shot entered his father's back, exiting his chest. Ronald followed this shot with a second into his father's back as well, but this one pierced his spine and lodged into his neck. As his mother began to rise, Ronald then opened fire on her with 2 shots as well. These shots shattered her rib cage and punctured a lung, causing it to collapse. Somehow, despite the noise of the rifle, no one in the house awoke. Ronald then made his way to the room that his younger brothers John and Mark shared. As he entered their room, he made his way between their beds and shot each of them once while they slept. Ronald then decided to move to the room of his 2 sisters, Allison and Dawn. Just as he entered the room, Allison sat up, and as she did, Ronald lowered the rifle to look at her face as he pulled the trigger, shooting her in the face. He then turned to shoot Dawn in the head as well. These murders all took place in less than 15 minutes. Ronald DeFeo Jr. then proceeded to clean up and try to establish an alibi. He showered, trimmed his beard, got dressed, and gathered his blood-covered clothes as well as the rifle, wrapping them in a pillowcase, and got into his car. He drove from the suburbs to Brooklyn to dispose of the evidence in a storm drain, and then headed back to Long Island and reported to work at his grandfather's car dealership at 6 a.m. Ronald would try calling his house many times, and when his father did not report to work, he ended up leaving around noon. He reportedly called his girlfriend to say he was getting off work early and wanted to come by to see her. Along the way, he stopped and talked to a friend. He then proceeded to his girlfriend's house, arriving there around 1:30 that afternoon. He spent the afternoon taking his girlfriend shopping for a bit and then going by a friend's house to see if he was going out that night. He told everyone he spoke to that he was locked out of the house and how he had been calling all day, but no one was answering the phone, even though all the cars were there. Around 6 p.m., Ronald arrived at a local bar called Henry's, Shortly after, he would tell his friends, "I'm going to have to go home and break a window to get in." He then left the bar to head home, only to return a short while later, appearing in a state of dismay, asking people to help him and stating, "Someone shot my mother and father." His friend and a small group of patrons piled into Ronald's car and headed to the DeFeo's home. When they arrived, Ronald's friend Bobby entered the property and headed up to the master bedroom. Another patron called the police from the kitchen phone. When Bobby returned outside, he found Ronald in dismay and overcome with grief. Within 10 minutes, the first officer, Kenneth Gaguski, arrived on the scene. As the officer approached a group of men he seen gathered on the front lawn, he noticed Ronald Jr. sobbing uncontrollably, and Ronald stated, "My mother and father are dead." The officer then entered the house and went upstairs to immediately find Ronald Sr. and Luisa's bodies. As he returned downstairs, he found Ronald Jr. sitting at the kitchen table, still crying. The officer then phoned police headquarters from the DeFeo's kitchen phone. As Ronald listened to the officer describe the scene, he alerted the officer that he also had two sisters. The officer raced back upstairs as another officer, Edwin Tyndall, arrived on scene. The two of them discovered Allison and Dawn's bodies. Around 7 that evening, the house was filled with police personnel and investigators, as well as spectators on the lawn. The neighborhood was buzzing with questions as interviews were being conducted. It was around this time that Ronald Joseph DeFeo Jr. would be taken to police headquarters to give his first statement. In this statement, he said he was home the night before and that he was up until 2 a.m. watching a TV show called Castle Keep. He then stated at 4 a.m. he walked past the upstairs bathroom where he saw his brother's wheelchair sitting in front of the door and he heard the toilet flush. He said that since he could not go back to sleep, he decided to head into work early. He then described the rest of his day, including how he had left work early, visited his girlfriend and his friend Bobby, drinking, and how he continually tried to reach his family via telephone. He stated when he returned home, he had to enter the home through the kitchen window, went upstairs and discovered his parents' bodies. He said he ran downstairs and headed back to Henry's bar to round up some men who helped alert the police. He submitted this as a written statement. The detectives continued to question Ronald about his family for hours. Around 3 a.m., the police finished questioning him for the evening and allowed him to go to sleep on a cot in a back filing room. At this time, the officers believed he was a cooperating witness and had no suspicions or reason to hold him as a suspect. But that was all about to change. As investigators continued to search the house and examine evidence at both the crime scene and the lab, a discovery was made in Ronald Jr.'s bedroom. The room had been given a quick look before, but upon a closer inspection, they spotted 2 cardboard boxes labeled as Marlin rifles in .22 and .35 calibers. At this time, they were unaware of the weapon used, but collected the boxes anyway. A short time later, the detective would arrive back at police headquarters to find out what the murder weapon had been: a .35 caliber Marlin rifle. At this point, they began looking at Ronald as a suspect. They then read him his rights and began to question him over the next 2 days. Ronald DeFeo Jr. finally confessed, after trying to change his story many times, and stated, "No, it all happened so fast. Once I started, I just couldn't stop. It went so fast." Almost a year later, on October 14th, 1975, Ronald Joseph DeFeo Jr. went to trial. At one point in the trial, Ronald stated, "Did I kill him? I killed them all. Yes, sir. I killed them all in self-defense." He continued, "As far as I'm concerned, if I didn't kill my family, they were going to kill me. And as far as I'm concerned, what I did was self-defense, and there was nothing wrong with it. When I got a gun in my hand, there's no doubt in my mind who I am. I am God." After days of trial, the jury was sent to deliberate, and on November 19th, 1975, a year and 5 days after the murders, the jury would return with a verdict. On Friday, November 21st, 1975, Ronald Joseph DeFeo Jr. was found guilty of 6 counts of second-degree murder. 2 weeks later, he would be sentenced to 25 years to life on all 6 counts. Ronald DeFeo Jr. lived out the rest of his life in the New York State Department of Corrections. He was transferred from Sullivan Correctional Facility in Fallsburg, New York, to a hospital on February 2nd, 2021. He died at the age of 69 on March 12, 2021 at the Albany Medical Center in New York. Throughout the years, there would be many controversies surrounding these murders. It was said that all 6 victims were found face down in their beds, but the police stated some of the victims were shot in the face. There were also questions as to why no one woke up during the murders, even though there were no suppressors used. The police said they found evidence of sedatives being used, however, the autopsy reports indicated otherwise. After Ronald's conviction, he continued to give multiple accounts of how the killings were carried out, even claiming at one point his sister Dawn had actually murdered their father after his mother killed the children before he then shot her. In 1990, Ronald DeFeo filed a motion to vacate his conviction, saying that the murders were actually carried out by Dawn and an unknown assailant. In 2000, he went on to claim Dawn himself and 2 friends all committed the murders. These murders would go on to live through 31 movies as well as 10 books and become a huge Hollywood franchise.